We hear the beeping of monitors. A Navy SEAL, mid-40s, weathered, blood soaking through field dressings, is wheeled through the hospital's trauma entrance. He's conscious, alert, dying carefully. Cut to a young female nurse, early 30s, dark eyes, composed, arranging supplies at a prep station. Her badge reads E. Ward RN. She's wearing standard scrubs. The chief surgeon, late 50s, silver-haired, imperious, enters and glances at her with dismissal. The chief surgeon didn't touch the instruments. You'll contaminate the field. She says nothing, doesn't look up. The SEAL is wheeled past. Their eyes meet for a single moment. His expression changes. Recognition. Feared, he reaches out. That wounded cell. No. Get her. Get Captain Ward. I'm not going under until chief surgeon. Cutting him off. Voice steel. You're not in command here anymore, son. The nurse, Captain Ward, steps forward. Quiet. Steady. Captain Wardies. He is cut to black. The morning began the way most mornings began at St. Augustine Memorial. Fluorescent light, the smell of antiseptic, the low murmur of a hospital deciding, hour by hour, who would live easily and who would not. Nurse Elena Ward arrived 40 minutes before her shift, as she always did. She checked the crash card in Bay 4 first, not because it was her assigned bay, but because the night nurse had a habit of leaving the defibrillator pads unstocked. She replaced them without comment, logged it, moved on. No one saw her do it. She preferred it that way. By 7 a.m., Dr. Marcus Halloway, chief of surgery, 26 years at St. Augustine, a man whose reputation preceded him in every room before he did, began his rounds. He moved through the ward like weather, and staff adjusted accordingly. That he stopped at Bay 6, where Ward was checking a post-op patient's vitals. Nurse Ward. He said her name the way a man reads an unfamiliar word off a menu. You changed the dressing on Mr. Aldridge without waiting for the resident's sign-off. The wound was showing early signs of infection, doctor. I documented it and paged Dr. Chen at 6:14. You paged him after you'd already acted. I stabilized the site first. Halloway looked at her for a long moment. Not really seeing her, the way people look at furniture they've decided is load-bearing but unremarkable. Don't touch the instruments. You'll contaminate the field. I don't need a nurse who thinks she's a surgeon. Ward said nothing. She adjusted the 4-drip rate by 2 milliliters, noted it on the chart, and moved to the next bed. That he's not wrong to be cautious, she thought. He's wrong about WHY.IT was not the first time. It would not be the last. Halloway had built his career on precision and control, to him, meant hierarchy, clean lines from surgeon down to resident down to nurse down to whatever came after that. Ward's file said she'd transferred from a regional trauma center 18 months ago. It said little else. Halloway had never asked for more, because the file told him everything he believed he needed to know. Competent enough, unremarkable, replaceable. To 940, a patient in Bay 2, a 61-year-old man recovering from a hernia repair, began to seize. The response was fast. Residents converged. Halloway arrived within 90 seconds, already calling for lorazepam, already positioning himself at the head of the bed as though gravity itself deferred to him. Ward was there first. She had already turned the patient onto his side, cleared the airway, and was timing the seizure on her watch when Halloway pushed past her. Move, he said. Not unkindly. Just certain. She moved. She stood at the foot of the bed and watched a room full of trained people do, slightly slower, what she had already begun doing. She noted the seizure duration, 87 seconds, and when Halloway called out, "How long has he been seizing?" It was a resident, not Ward, who answered, because Ward had already stepped back to hand the timing card to someone who would be credited for it. She did not correct the record. Later in the supply room, a junior nurse named Priya found her restocking gauze with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. That he does that to everyone, Priya said. Don't let it get to you. That it doesn't, Ward said, and meant it in a way Priya couldn't have understood. Not resignation, not thick skin. Something closer to a soldier's patience with a chain of command that hadn't yet learned who was standing in the room with them. She finished stocking the shelf, squared the boxes so the labels faced outward, and checked her watch. Somewhere over the Pacific, though she didn't know it yet, A helicopter carrying a critically wounded man was already turning toward the coast. She had 11 hours left in her shift. She had no idea it would be the last ordinary one for a long time. By Thursday, the pattern had a name, even if no one said it aloud. Ward wasn't given complex cases. She wasn't paged for consults. When a multi-trauma came through the ER, she was assigned to intake paperwork while residents half her experience handled triage. She didn't ask why. She'd learned a long time ago that asking why in front of the wrong audience only invited an answer built to justify itself. Instead, she watched Dr. Chun, second-year resident, sharp but green, misread a potassium level on a post-cardiac patient and nearly order a correction that would have pushed the man into arrhythmia. She caught it before it reached the pharmacy, flagged it quietly on the chart with a note reading, "Recommend re-verify K+ prior to administration," and let Chun find it himself 20 minutes later. Chun came to her afterward pale. "That would have killed him." "You caught it," Ward said. "That's what matters." "You caught it. You corrected it," she said, and turned back to her charting. She could have gone to Holloway. She could have made it a moment, proof, evidence, a small crack in the wall of his certainty. She didn't. Not out of fear. Out of calculation. A wound reported becomes a wound defended. A mistake corrected quietly becomes a lesson learned. She had spent years understanding the difference between the two, in rooms far more dangerous than this one. But the cost of her silence was accumulating. The way sediment accumulates. Invisible, until it isn't. Holloway, for his part, grew more confident in his read of her. In the staff lounge, she overheard him telling a visiting cardiologist, "Good hands, limited judgment. The kind you keep close but don't hand anything sharp. Laughter. Not cruel. Exactly. Just the laughter of men who have never had their assumptions cost them anything." Ward drank her coffee and said nothing. That afternoon, a code came through on the overhead speaker. Not for her floor, but close enough that she heard the details relayed at the nurse's station. A cardiac arrest in the parking structure. Visitor, not patient. Down for an unknown period. She was 3 floors up. By the time she reached the stairwell, 2 residents were already jogging ahead of her. She let them go. It wasn't her call, her floor, her patient. She stopped at the stairwell window instead and watched the scene below. Small, distant, orderly. Compressions. A defibrillator arriving. The rhythm of a trained team functioning as it should. Not everything needs me, she thought. That's not the job. The job is knowing which fires you walk into and which ones you let others put out. It was a discipline most people mistook for passivity. It was not passivity. It was economy. The conservation of a particular kind of attention for the moment it would be needed and could not be replaced. She didn't know yet what that moment would look like. She only knew, the way a soldier knows weather is turning before the first drop falls, that something in the rhythm of the hospital had shifted. Radio traffic on the ambulance bay channel had picked up that morning, clipped, unusually formal. A supply order for O-negative blood, doubled. A trauma bay held open since noon, unassigned. For reasons no one below a certain rank had been told that at 4:50 p.m., an announcement came over the hospital's internal line, flat and procedural. Attention staff. Trauma Bay 1 to remain clear. Incoming military medevac. ETA 1800 hours. All non-essential personnel to reassign. Holloway straightened at the nurse's station like a man hearing his name called at an awards dinner. "Finally," he said, to no one in particular. "Something worth my hands." Ward said nothing. She logged her last chart of the shift, squared the pen against the clipboard, and did not clock out. She had 11 hours left. She told herself 2 days ago. She had been wrong about the number. She had not been wrong about the shape of what was coming. The trauma bay had the particular quiet of a room built for violence that hadn't arrived. WY 5:30. It was fully staffed. 2 surgeons, 3 residents, 4 nurses, a respiratory therapist, an anesthesiologist on standby. Holloway stood at the center of it, already gowned, already rehearsing the case in his head the way a man rehearses a speech he's certain will be quoted. "Military medevac," he said to the room, reading off the printed briefing. "Gunshot wound, lower abdomen, possible internal bleeding. Field medics stabilized en route. ETA, 15 minutes. He looked up. "This is not a training exercise. I want silence in this room unless you're speaking to me directly." Ward stood near the supply cart. checking the O-negative units against the log for the third time. She hadn't been assigned to the case. She'd assigned herself, quietly, the way she assigned herself to the crash cart every morning. Not asking permission, simply appearing where competence might be needed and hoping no one questioned the arithmetic of it. Holloway noticed her anyway. "Ward, this isn't your bay." "Extra hands," she said. "You're short a circulating nurse." Denise called in 20 minutes ago that he hesitated, the calculation visible on his face, weighing his distaste for her against the arithmetic of an understaffed trauma bay. Pragmatism won, barely. "Stay by the supply cart. Don't touch the patient unless I say so." Understood. She had said that word, understood, more times in the last 2 weeks than she had in the 2 years before it. It was a useful word. It committed to nothing. AT 544, the radio crackled. "Incoming, 60 seconds. 1 patient, priority 1. GSW abdomen, secondary shrapnel wounds, BP 88/50 and dropping. Patient is combative, refusing sedation, repeating a name, unclear, possibly a designation. Advise trauma team." Holloway frowned at the combative detail. Refusing sedation on a GSW with that BP. He's either delirious or he's the most disciplined patient I've ever heard of. Ward's hands stilled on the blood log for exactly 1 second. No one saw it. No one was looking at her hands. Refusing sedation, repeating a designation. She knew before the doors opened, before the gurney came through, in the way a person recognizes a voice on the phone before a word is spoken. Not with certainty, but with the cold, specific dread of pattern recognition. She had heard men refuse sedation before. She had heard them repeat call signs, unit numbers, coordinates, anything to keep from losing the thread of a mission mid-surgery. It was not delirium. It was training. It was a man trying to protect something even as his body failed around it. She set the blood log down very precisely and did not let her expression change. Outside, the wail of the ambulance bay doors began their mechanical rise. Holloway squared his shoulders, chin lifted, already composing the story he would tell later about the night he saved a soldier's life. Ward stepped back from the gurney's path, positioned herself near the head of the bed, not the foot, where nurses were expected to stand, but the head, where command stood, and waited. She did not know yet that the man on the gurney would recognize her. She only knew that somewhere in the last 90 seconds, the careful architecture of the last 18 months, the quiet, the deference, the discipline of being underestimated, had begun, very softly, to come apart. The doors opened. The gurney came through fast, flanked by 2 flight medics still in their flight suits, blood to the elbows, moving with the clipped economy of people who had done this before and expected to do it again before the night was over. Male, mid-40s, GSW lower right abdomen, secondary shrapnel to the thigh, BP 84/48, SATS 91 on room air, 2 units in en route, refusing further sedation. "Get him on the monitor," Holloway said, already moving to the patient's side. "Let's get eyes on that wound." The man on the gurney was pale, sweat-streaked, jaw tight with a pain he was visibly refusing to acknowledge. His eyes were open, sharp, too sharp for a man losing that much blood. He was scanning the room the way a man scans a room when he has spent a career learning that rooms are not safe until you've counted every exit. His gaze crossed Ward that he stopped. For 1 full second, nothing else in the trauma bay existed to him. Not the pain, not the blood pressure alarm beginning its soft, insistent chime. Not Holloway's hands already moving toward his abdomen. "Captain," he said. His voice was wrecked, but the word came out clean, formal, a word with weight in it. "Captain Ward." The room did not stop. Rooms like this never stop, but something in it shifted, a half-beat of attention, a flicker of eyes toward Ward and back, the kind of thing that happens in the space between one heartbeat and the next and is gone before anyone can be sure they saw it. Holloway didn't look up from the wound. "Sir, I need you to stay still. You're safe. Let us work. Get her," the man said, louder now, ignoring him entirely. "I'm not going under until she clears the room. I'm not going under until I know who's got eyes on the door." "There is no door, sir. You're in a hospital. Get her." Ward had not moved. She stood very still near the head of the bed, hands loose at her sides, expression unreadable. Every instinct that had kept her alive in places far worse than this one was telling her exactly what was happening. The man was not delirious, and he was not asking for comfort. He was asking for command confirmation. He needed to know, before he let himself lose consciousness, that the room was secure, that someone with authority he trusted was watching IT. IT was a request she recognized because she had made it herself, once, on a table much like this one, in a country she still didn't talk about. Holloway straightened, irritation cutting through his clinical calm. "Sir, I don't know what you think you're seeing, but this is Nurse Ward, and she is not. She's Naval Special Warfare." The man's voice cracked with effort, but the words came out precise, deliberate. A man spending his remaining strength on the one thing he decided mattered. "Captain, 6. I served under her in." "That's enough." Ward's voice, for the first time, cut through the room. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The man's eyes found hers again, and something in his face eased. Not because the pain had lessened, but because he had said what he needed to say and trusted, absolutely, that she had heard it. "Copy," he whispered, and let his head fall back. His pressure dropped 6 points in the next 10 seconds. Holloway stared at Ward across the gurney, the wound forgotten for one dangerous half-second. His face caught somewhere between disbelief and the first cold edge of doubt. "What," he said slowly, "is he talking about?" Ward looked back at him, calm, level, and said nothing at all, because the patient's oxygen saturation had just dropped to 87, and there were priorities in the room more urgent than Holloway's confusion. "Doctor," she said, his pressure's falling. "You need to move." For the first time in 18 months, Holloway did exactly what she told him to do that he would not remember later deciding to listen. He would only remember that he had. The saturation alarm climbed into an insistent rhythm, and for 3 seconds the room organized itself around panic instead of procedure. The particular chaos of trained people all reaching for the same emergency at once. Ward moved first, not toward the door, not away, as she had for 18 months. She stepped into the space beside the gurney that had always, unspoken, belonged to whoever held the highest rank in the room. "He's got a tension pneumothorax forming on the right," she said, already pressing 2 fingers below the man's clavicle. Feeling for the deviation she'd cataloged from the way his trachea had shifted, the way his right chest wall had stopped rising with the left. "Breath sounds are absent on that side. That's not the abdominal wound dropping his sats. That's a collapsed lung." Holloway's hands stilled over the abdominal dressing. "I didn't order a chest film." "There isn't time for a chest film." She was already reaching for the 14-gauge needle tray, without looking at it, her hand finding the correct drawer on the first try, the way a person's hand finds a light switch in a house they've lived in for years. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. He needs a needle decompression in the next 90 seconds, or his sats keep dropping and his heart follows. That is not a nurse's call to make. "It's not a nurse's call," she agreed. "It's a call someone in this room needs to make right now, and I've made it before, and you're still deciding whether to believe me that IT was the most she had said to him in 18 months. It did not sound like defiance. It sounded like a diagnosis, flat, clinical, already correct. Holloway looked at the monitor. "Sats, 84. Falling. He looked at her. Something in 26 years of training. Not deference, not trust, but the older, deeper instinct of a surgeon who has learned to recognize competence even in places he refuses to look for it. Made the decision before his pride could argue with it, he said. Now. She was already moving. The needle went in clean, angled precisely over the third rib to avoid the neurovascular bundle beneath, and the hiss of trapped air escaping the pleural space was audible in the sudden quiet of the room. The monitor's tone shifted, the number climbing. 84, 87, 91, like something surfacing. Sats improving, the respiratory therapist said. Disbelief threaded through the relief in her voice. Holloway hadn't moved. He was looking at Ward's hands, steady, sure, already withdrawing the needle and taping the makeshift valve in place with a competence that belonged nowhere in her personnel file. Where did you learn to do that? He said. It wasn't really a question. It was a man rebuilding a wall that had just taken its first structural hit. Continue the abdominal repair, Doctor, Ward said, not answering him. He's bought time. Not much. She stepped back to the head of the bed, Not the foot, not the supply cart, the head, and for a moment no one in the room corrected her position. Not the residents, not the medics, not even Holloway. The patient's eyes fluttered half open, glassy with blood loss and the beginning edge of anesthesia. He found her face again, the way a compass finds north whether or not anyone's watching. Perimeter, he murmured. Barely a word. Secure, she said quietly, just for him. You're clear to go under, Commander. I have the room. He exhaled, the specific exhale of a man who has been holding something together through sheer will and has finally been given permission to stop. And the anesthesiologist's medication took him under 30 seconds later, clean and easy, his vitals settling into something the monitors could work with. Holloway stood over the abdominal wound, gloved hands hovering, staring at Ward across the unconscious body between them. Captain, he said slowly, testing the word like it might be a mistake. He called you Captain. He's lost a lot of blood, Doctor, Ward said. You should focus on the wound. That it was not a denial. Holloway noticed that it was not a denial, that he said nothing further, but for the rest of the surgery, every instruction he gave the room, he checked, first, involuntarily, almost against his will, to see whether Ward agreed with it. She did not always answer. That, too, he noticed. The abdominal wound was worse than the field report had suggested. Holloway worked with the focus of a man trying to rebuild his authority one clean incision at a time, but the shrapnel had traveled at an angle the imaging hadn't fully captured, and 20 minutes into the repair, he hit something the textbooks hadn't prepared him for. There's foreign material here that isn't shrapnel, he said, frowning at the wound. Fragments, metal, but composite, casing of some kind. He glanced at the anesthesiologist. Give me a specimen tray. I want this documented and sent to pathology. No, Ward's voice again. Quiet. Absolute. Holloway looked up, forceps still in the wound. Excuse me? That material doesn't go to pathology. It doesn't get documented in the standard chart. It gets bagged, sealed, and held for retrieval by his unit's liaison. She hadn't moved from her position at the head of the bed, but her eyes were on the wound with the specific focus of someone reading a map only she could see. That's not shrapnel from an IED or a standard round, Doctor. That's fragmentation casing from ordnance that shouldn't exist in any inventory this hospital's imaging system would recognize. If it goes into a routine pathology log, it goes into a database. If it goes into a database, it's a paper trail leading back to an operation that was never supposed to leave a paper trail. The room had gone very still. You're telling me, Holloway said slowly, that my patient's wound is classified. I'm telling you his wound is evidence of something that needs to stay contained to the people in this room, Doctor. That's all you need to know. And honestly, it's more than you need to know. I'm asking you to trust me on the chain of custody. Nothing else changes about how you treat him. Holloway's jaw worked. 26 years of practice had built him a particular relationship with certainty. He was accustomed to being the informed person in any room he occupied, and the sensation of not being that, here now, over an open abdomen, was clearly costing him something. I have a legal obligation to document what I find in a patient's body, he said. I don't take orders from a nurse about what goes in a medical record. You're right, Ward said. You don't. So don't think of it as an order. Think of it as information you didn't have 20 seconds ago that changes your legal exposure, not lessens it. If that material surfaces in a civilian pathology database and someone connects it to an operation that 3 governments have agreed never happened, this hospital's legal department will spend the next decade wishing you'd asked one more question before you sent it upstairs. IT was the longest thing she'd said to him since the day she started. It did not sound like pleading. It sounded like someone laying out a briefing she'd given 100 times before, in rooms with far higher ceilings and far worse consequences for getting it wrong. Holloway looked down at the wound, looked at the small, dull fragment held in his forceps, inert, unremarkable to the eye, and apparently radioactive in every way that mattered. Bag it, he said finally to the scrub nurse. Sealed, not logged in the standard specimen system. He didn't look at Ward when he said it. Noted in my personal case file only. Thank you, Ward said. I'm not doing this for you, Holloway said, a little too fast. I'm doing this because I don't have time to argue with a nurse about jurisdiction while a man is bleeding out on my table. Understood, Ward said, and the word had exactly as much weight as it always did, which was to say, whatever weight he needed it to have, and no more. The repair continued for another 40 minutes. Twice more, Holloway found himself deferring to details Ward supplied without explanation. The specific antibiotic regimen for a wound type she seemed to recognize on sight. The recommendation to hold off imaging the shrapnel track until a name she wouldn't say arrived to consult, to be by the time the final sutures went in and the patient's vitals settled into something stable. Holloway had stopped asking her how she knew what she knew. He had started, instead, watching her the way a man watches. Whether he's finally decided to take seriously, not with trust, not yet, but with the wary, recalculating attention of someone who suspects he has badly misjudged the size of the storm standing next to him. Closing, he said to the room, and then, almost involuntarily, glanced at Ward. "Anything else I should know before I close?" "No," she said. "You did good work tonight." Dr. Duddy didn't answer. But something in his shoulders, for the first time in 18 months, eased slightly. The specific relief of a man who has just been told, by someone he no longer fully understands, that he passed. The patient was moved to the ICU at 8:15 p.m., stable but critical, his vitals holding in the narrow band between recovery and relapse. Holloway should have gone home. Instead, he found himself in the ICU an hour later, ostensibly checking post-op orders, actually watching Ward through the glass as she adjusted the patient's ventilator settings with a precision that had nothing hesitant in IT. 940. The patient crashed, not violently. The monitors didn't scream at first. Just a slow drift. Blood pressure sliding from 102/64 to 88/50 over the course of 4 minutes. Heart rate climbing to compensate. Urine output dropping to nearly nothing in the collection bag. The kind of decline that looks, to an inexperienced eye, like something that can wait 10 more minutes for a full workup. Holloway, paged in from the surgeon's lounge, arrived and read the numbers with the confidence of a man who had already decided what they meant. "Post-op hypotension," he said. "Likely fluid deficit from the intraoperative blood loss. Bolus another liter of crystalloid. Recheck in 20 minutes." No. Ward was already at the bedside, her hand resting against the patient's abdomen, feeling for a firmness that hadn't been there an hour ago. This isn't a fluid deficit. His abdomen's distending. He's bleeding internally, slow but active. If you bolus him with crystalloid, you dilute his clotting factors and speed up the hemorrhage. He needs back into the OR now, and he needs blood products, not saline. I closed that wound myself 2 hours ago. I know what I did in there. I know you do. I'm telling you what's happening now, not 2 hours ago. That Holloway's face hardened. The specific hardening of a man whose authority has already been quietly eroded once tonight and has decided, somewhere in the last 90 minutes, that it will not happen again. I appreciate whatever expertise you think you have, Nurse Ward, but this is a surgical decision, and I am the surgeon. Bolus the fluids. The room, 2 residents, an ICU nurse, a respiratory therapist, went very still, the particular stillness of people watching a disagreement they are not senior enough to referee. Ward did not raise her voice. She did not reach for drama. She simply looked at him, and something in her bearing changed. Not larger, not louder, but settled, the way a fact settles once it stops needing to argue for itself. "Dr. Holloway, I am giving you a direct clinical assessment, and if you choose to disregard it, I will document that I raised the concern, the time I raised it, and the specific reasoning, in this patient's chart, effective immediately. I will also be contacting his unit's medical liaison, whose number is in my phone, to advise them that his attending surgeon is declining to act on evidence of active internal hemorrhage. That call will happen whether or not you bolus the fluids. The only thing your decision changes is whether he's already back in the OR by the time that liaison arrives. That IT was not a threat. It did not sound like one. It sounded like a woman reading a consequence off a clipboard. The way she read everything, flat, procedural, and entirely certain. Holloway stared at her. Something in his mind, the part of him that had spent 26 years learning to read a room for the difference between insubordination and information, finally, belatedly, did its job that he looked back at the monitor. Blood pressure, 84/46. Distension, visible now even to him, along the left flank. "Get the OR prepped," he said, to the room, not to her. Type and cross 4 units. I want him back on the table in 10 minutes. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge what had just happened between them, not out loud. But as the room burst into motion around him, he glanced once more at Ward, and this time there was no irritation in it. There was something closer to recognition, the look of a man who has just understood, all at once, that the person he had spent 18 months instructing not to touch the instruments had just, in the plainest possible terms, told him how to save a life and been right. The second surgery found a bleeding vessel Holloway had missed on the first pass, a small arterial nick easy to overlook, catastrophic to ignore. He repaired it in 11 minutes. That he did not speak to Ward again that night beyond the clinical necessities of the case. But when the surgery ended and the patient's vitals finally held steady, really held, the way vitals hold when a body has stopped fighting its own repair, Holloway stood at the scrub sink for a long moment, hands under the water, saying nothing. Then quietly, not looking at her. How did you know? About the vessel. Before the numbers confirmed it, Ward considered the question and gave him the only true answer she had. I've watched a lot of people bleed, doctor. You learn to see it before the monitor does. He did not ask her where. He had, by then, stopped believing he wanted to know the answer more than he wanted to trust the hands that had just been right twice in one night. By midnight, the patient, Commander Eris Voss, though the name would appear nowhere on the hospital's official record beyond a placeholder alias, was stable in the ICU, sedated, breathing on his own, his vitals holding in the quiet, unremarkable range that surgeons dream about and rarely mention out loud for fear of tempting the numbers back the wrong way. Holloway sat in the surgeon's lounge at 12:30 a.m., still in his scrubs, a cooling cup of coffee in front of him that he hadn't touched. He was not thinking about the surgery. He was thinking about a woman he had, 6 hours earlier, told not to touch the instruments. At 1:15 a.m., 2 men in plain dark suits arrived at the nurse's station. No hospital ID badges. No visible weapons, though something about the way they moved suggested they were rarely without a plan for acquiring one. They asked politely for whoever was overseeing Commander Voss's care. The charge nurse, flustered, went to find Holloway. Holloway arrived to find the 2 men already speaking with someone, not him. Ward stood between them in the corridor outside the ICU, her posture entirely different from the one she wore on the floor. Straighter, stiller, a posture built for rooms with far more at stake than a hospital hallway. Captain, the taller of the 2 men said, and there was no hesitation in the word at all, no testing of it the way Holloway had tested it hours earlier. Command sends their regards. They'd like a full brief when you're able. Tell them 48 hours, Ward said. He's not stable enough to move, and I'm not leaving until he is. Understood, Captain. The man's eyes flicked, briefly, to Holloway, a glance that assessed him, filed him, and dismissed him in under 2 seconds, the particular efficiency of men who had learned long ago not to waste attention on people outside the chain of relevance. Doctor, good work tonight. We'll need your notes on the procedure, sanitized per the earlier arrangement. Of course, Holloway said, because it was the only thing left to say. The men left as quietly as they'd come. The corridor, for a moment, held only the 3 of them, Holloway, Ward, and the low mechanical hum of the ICU monitors through the glass. Captain, Holloway said, testing the rank now not as an accusation, but as a fact he was still assembling the shape of. How long? 14 years, Ward said. 6 active. The rest in places that don't go on a resume. And the nursing is not a cover story, doctor, if that's what you're asking. I trained as a combat medic first. The nursing license came after, a way to keep doing the only work I've ever been good at, in a life that no longer required me to jump out of helicopters to do it. She looked at him, and there was no triumph in her expression, no vindication, nothing that resembled the moment he might have imagined, somewhere in the last 6 hours, that this conversation would become. I didn't take this job to prove anything to you, Dr. Holloway. I took it because I was tired and this hospital needed nurses, and I am actually a very good one. You let me humiliate you. For 18 months. You didn't humiliate me. You underestimated me. Those aren't the same thing, and only one of them was ever going to cost you something. Holloway absorbed that the way a man absorbs a diagnosis he suspected but hadn't wanted confirmed. What happens now, Ward said. I go back to being a nurse you occasionally listen to. Nothing about tonight goes in any record beyond what's already been arranged. No one else needs to know what you know. That's not a request, doctor. That's the arrangement those two men just confirmed on my behalf. She turned to go back into the ICU, and Holloway found himself asking the question before he could decide whether he had the right to. Why didn't you ever correct me? Any of it. You could have ended this 18 months ago with one phone call. Ward paused at the door, and for the first time all night, something almost gentle crossed her face. Not warmth, exactly, but the tired patience of someone who had spent a career being the most capable person in rooms that never asked. Because the job was never about being believed, doctor, she said. It was about the patient surviving whether or not anyone believed me. Tonight he did. That's the only report I file. She went back into the ICU. Holloway stood alone in the corridor for a long time, staring at the closed door, recalculating, quietly, privately, with no audience left to perform the recalculation for everything he thought he had understood about the woman he had spent a year and a half telling not to touch the instruments. The locker room at 3 a.m. was empty except for the hum of the vending machine down the hall and the particular silence of a hospital between shifts, when even the corridors seemed to exhale. Ward sat on the bench in front of her locker, still in her scrubs, hands loosely folded, not yet moving to change. She had checked on Voss twice more since the men in the suits left. Vitals steady, sedation appropriate, the slow, unremarkable recovery of a body finally allowed to do the work it had been fighting to do all night. She would check again in 20 minutes. For now, there was nothing to do but sit with the particular exhaustion that came after, the kind that had nothing to do with hours worked and everything to do with the weight of a room she'd been holding together without anyone knowing she was holding it. The door opened. Dr. Chun, the resident from 2 chapters and 2 weeks ago, the one who had nearly pushed a fatal potassium correction, stepped in, saw her, hesitated. I heard, he said. Some of it. I don't know what I heard, honestly. There were 2 guys in suits, and the charge nurse won't stop staring at you. And Holloway left an hour ago without saying a word to anyone, which is somehow the strangest part. Ward almost smiled. That does sound like him. Chin sat down on the bench across from her, still in his white coat, looking younger than she'd noticed before. The particular youth of someone who had just watched the architecture of his understanding of a hospital's hierarchy quietly rearrange itself. Are you actually? He stopped. Started again. The suits called you captain. I'm actually a nurse, Dr. Chen. That part was never a lie. She considered how much of the rest belonged to him, and decided, as she had decided about nearly everyone in this building for 18 months, that it belonged to no one who didn't need it to do their job. The rest isn't something I'm going to explain tonight, or probably ever, to most people here. That night with the potassium, he said slowly. You knew. Right away. You always know right away, don't you? That's not luck. No, she agreed. It isn't. He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched him arrive on his own at the same recalibration Holloway had reached in the corridor a few hours earlier. The understanding that competence had been standing next to him for weeks, unremarked, doing work invisible enough that only its absence would have been noticed. Why didn't you say something that night? You could have just told me, because you needed to find it yourself, Dr. Chun. If I'd told you, you'd have remembered that I caught your mistake. If you found it yourself, you remember that you're capable of catching your own mistakes. One of those things makes you a better doctor. The other just makes you grateful to me. She stood, finally, and reached for her locker. Gratitude doesn't save patience. Competence does. I'd rather you have the second thing. Chin sat with that for a moment. That's a hard way to live. Letting people think less of you so they can learn something. It's not a hard way to live, Ward said, and there was no self-pity in it, only the flat honesty of someone who had made her peace with the arithmetic a long time ago, in circumstances far more costly than a hospital ward. It's just a quiet one. Most of the work that actually matters is quiet, Dr. Chun. You'll learn that, if you're any good. She changed out of her scrubs, folded them with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything, and did not tell him, because it wasn't his to carry, that the quiet cost something, that there were 18 months of small, swallowed corrections, of standing at the foot of bed she should have been standing at the head of watching credit go to people who hadn't earned it because handing it to them was cheaper, in the ledger she kept than the alternative. She had learned long ago that the price of being trusted with real authority was rarely paid in the moment of crisis. It was paid in all the ordinary hours before it, the ones where you let yourself be small, so that when the moment came, no one would think to look at you twice before it was already too late to matter. Do better, she told Chun at the door, and it wasn't cold. It was the only currency she had ever found worth spending. That's the only thing I need from you. She left him sitting in the locker room and walked back toward the ICU, where a man who had once trusted her with his life in a country neither of them would ever name was finally, quietly, healing. 3 weeks later, the operating room was quiet in the way ordinary surgeries are quiet. No urgency, no men in dark suits waiting in corridors, no fragments of classified ordnance needing careful handling. A gallbladder removal. Routine. The kind of case that had filled Ward's days before a helicopter changed the shape of one Tuesday night. Holloway worked with his usual precision, and Ward assisted as circulating nurse. And between them there was a different quality to the silence than there had been 18 months ago. Not warmer, exactly, but settled. Two people who had stopped needing to prove anything to each other because the proving had already happened, once, thoroughly, and neither saw the need to revisit it. Clamp, he said. She had it in his hand before he finished the word, and he glanced at her, briefly, the way he had taken to doing since that night. Not suspicion anymore, not even curiosity. Something closer to the habit of a man checking that the ground beneath him was still where he'd left it. Commander Voss had been transferred out 11 days earlier, moved to a military medical facility for the remainder of his recovery. He'd asked to see Ward before he left. She had gone briefly, and he had said only, "Thank you for the room, Captain," and she had said, "Thank you for trusting it." And that had been the whole of it. No ceremony, no debrief, nothing that would ever appear in any record either of them would keep. Holloway had not asked her again about the 14 years, or the 6 active, or the places that didn't go on a resume. He had once, in the week after, started to say something about arranging a formal acknowledgement, a letter, a mention to hospital administration, something that would put her name somewhere it could be seen. "Don't," she'd said. Just that. And he hadn't. Now, in the gallbladder case, halfway through, the patient's oxygen saturation dipped. Not dramatically, just a soft 2-point slide that the anesthesiologist hadn't yet flagged, the kind of small drift that separates a good outcome from a great one, noticed early enough or not. Sats trending down, Ward said quietly, before the monitor's alarm threshold caught up to the number. Check the ET2 position. Might have migrated during positioning. The anesthesiologist checked. It had. He adjusted it, and the number climbed back, and no one in the room but Ward and Holloway registered that anything had happened at all. Holloway didn't look up from the incision. "Thank you, Nurse Ward. Of course, Dr.IT was on the surface, exactly the exchange it would have been 18 months ago. The same words, the same rhythm, a nurse noted, a nurse thanked. But something in the weight of it had changed, quietly, permanently, in a way that would never announce itself to anyone else in the room. He was listening now, truly listening, not merely tolerating. And she was still, deliberately, by choice, because it was the only way she knew how to do this work, standing at the foot of the bed instead of the head, letting the credit for a life saved settle, wherever it settled, asking for none of it back. The surgery ended without incident. The patient woke, recovered, went home 3 days later never knowing how close the margin had been, or whose eyes had caught it. Ward finished her shift at 7 p.m., changed out of her scrubs, and walked out into the ordinary evening light of the parking lot. Unremarkable, unhurried, a nurse among nurses, exactly as she had chosen, all those years ago, to be seen. She did not look back at the hospital. She had never needed anyone to. And